Well, welcome to this first session of the reality of history. And if you're anything like me, history was as boring as yesterday's porridge at school, and I didn't enjoy history at all. It had absolutely no relevance to me or anybody that I knew. So we were taught English history. We learned about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, and we learned about William the Conqueror in 1066. And our attitude then and my attitude now is, so what? It was absolutely of no interest to me at all, or any of my peers. We weren't taught our own history, and even after more than 150 years of European settlement, we're only just starting to teach New Zealand history in our schools. And I think that's an abysmal failure. But when I was quite young and became a journalist, a very long time ago, I became interested in history because I was one of the few bilingual Pākehā journalists in the country. I don't know of another one at that time. This was in the 1960s. And I had grown up in a predominantly Maori community where everybody was bilingual to some degree. And it wasn't unusual. Everybody was like that, and I imagined everybody else was like that. When our parents brought us out of there, it was a bit of a culture shock. I was still at primary school, and I had to learn to speak English properly, and I found that very, very difficult. If I got excited, I would drop Maori words into my English, and sometimes English words into my Maori, and I'd mix the languages up. And my teachers, God bless their patient souls, had a lot of difficulty with me in those years, and I didn't like school, and school didn't like me. But when I became a journalist, I became one of the few, I think, journalists with specific responsibilities in Maori affairs. And that opened a lot of doors to me, and it also closed a lot of doors to me. But when I got to Marlborough in the 1980s, there was a lot of things happening there, particularly with the Ngaitahu settlement. So I was able to go to Maori language hearings and translate most of that for a Pākehā audience. And I was astonished at the resentment those stories brought to the Pākehā community. And it dawned on me then that that resentment came about because they simply didn't know the history of New Zealand. And far too many people today still don't know. So when we have Treaty of Waitangi settlements, when tribes bring claims against the Crown, there's a wave of resentment flows through the community again, and it's simply because people don't know the history, don't know why. So at that point I thought, well, somebody needs to do something about this. It never dawned on me at all that somebody might be me. So one weekend I was out on D'Urville Island as a journalist, and in the evening sitting around the fire, as we did in those days, two old tribal leaders, one from Ngāti Toa and one from Ngāti Kwata, began telling stories. And there was a group of about 10 or 15 of us. And most of it was in Maori because most of the other people there were Maori, and I think I was about the only Pākehā there. And towards the end of the evening, I asked one of those guys, have any of these stories ever been written down? And he said, no, most of it's oral history. And I said, well, it should be written down. And he looked at me and he said, yes, it should be. That's your job. I was taken aback by that. And I said, well, I don't know enough to write these things down. I need to talk to lots of people. And he said, well, that's what you're here for. I wasn't there for that at all, but he assumed that that's what I was there. So from that, I took it that I had at least his approval to start digging into New Zealand's pre-European history. And I picked on a subject and a man who probably had more written about him than most other tribal leaders, and a lot of that's inaccurate, a lot of it's wrong, and particularly the interpretation of the facts. And that man was Te Rauparaha. Now, as it turned out, his original home was the same place as my original home. So I grew up and spent my formative years in Kawhia and Taranaki. So I told these old guys that that's what I intended to do. They said, well, you need to know more than is written in the books. And I knew that. So over several months, I sat with these guys and listened to the most amazing story about a man who has been misjudged by history. Now, there are a lot of historians who have done a huge amount of work recording the history of that time. Patricia Burns in particular wrote an amazing book called Te Rauparaha, A New Perspective, which I relied on. But she was an accomplished historian, writing largely for historians. And I was impressed by the way that she had delved into that history. But most people I spoke to weren't interested in reading it, which was a real shame, because that book should have been a textbook in our schools, and it still isn't. So going back to those two old guys, they're gone now, I asked them how to overcome that, and they just said, make it personal. And I didn't really know how to do that until it dawned on me that if I created an artificial character, dropped that character into history and told that artificial character's story, I could personalise it and I could stitch together the known facts of history with fiction, but as long as that fiction didn't interrupt or impede the accuracy of history, I could make it very personal. So I could put personal emotions in there and tell the story as if I was there. It was a challenge to get the first book written. Well, once I did that, and I called that Time to Kawhia, once I did that, the second and third books came relatively easy. It was the story, the real personal story of what New Zealand was like before Europeans got here. How tough that life was, how complex that life was. New Zealand Maori were the last people who you could honestly call Stone Age hunter-gatherers to be discovered by Europeans. And there's always been assumptions that Stone Age people were unsophisticated and primitive and brutal. Absolutely untrue. No more brutal than the Irish clans or the Scottish clans, and more complex than most people today even understand in their philosophy, in their religious beliefs, and how they conducted their lives. So those three books not only tell the story of what happened and who made it happen, but why they did that, and that hasn't been well told. So that's the first task over. When we come back next week, we'll talk about the impact of Irish people in New Zealand, where they came from, why they got here, and how they got here, and the impact of their contribution, relatively unrecognised, on the New Zealand that we have today. So, in the meantime, have another cup of tea and I'll see you next week.